Envisiontech podcast. I'm your host, Paul Geoghegan, and this week I'm going to be talking about what accessibility looks like in the real world. I've talked a lot about accessibility in the digital space here on the podcast, but I haven't really talked much about accessibility in the real world. By that I mean accessibility with everyday products that you might use. Whether it be, a coffee machine or whether you're out somewhere and walking around. What does accessibility look like with those sorts of things? Let's start with the example that I mentioned about making coffee. So, coffee machines, right? There's loads of different ones and they're all quite different, depending on what brand it's from and even what model you have. Some coffee machines just have one button on them and some have a lot. And I've had both. I've had a coffee machine that had one button, and currently I have one that has, I think it has three, and then it has a dial as well that you can turn. So these coffee machines, I don't technically know what the buttons do, at least, when I first buy it. So they don't have braille or anything really that lets me know what each thing does. So, for example, on our current coffee machine, I know that there are two buttons on the left and one button on the right. And actually, there might be more buttons than that, but if there are, I don't use them, so I don't know. But yeah, there's three that I'm aware of, and the top left one is for the temperature. I believe the bottom left one makes the water pressure higher, I think. I don't really use that button too often. Then the button on the right will actually start the machine, and then the dial on the outside is for the temperature. But the problem with this is it will kind of save your settings as far as I'm aware. So every time I go to use it, I have to plug it out and plug it back in to make sure that it's been reset. Because I know how many times I need to press the temperature button to get it to the temperature that I want, or how many times I need to turn the dial to get it to the size that I want. But I don't know what temperature or size it has selected when I go in there. So that's why I have to plug it out and plug it back in, because that resets those settings every time. And that's an example of how, even if something isn't necessarily accessible, you can work around it. I had my wife tell me what the buttons did and tell me, it starts off on this setting, and then if you press it once, it'll go to the settings. Then I could kind of figure out from there, it's just going to keep cycling through the settings. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but you can kind of work around some of these things. But obviously in an ideal world, they would be a bit more accessible, and there would be a way for me to tell what setting it's currently on. That kind of applies to a lot of general appliances. And there are some exceptions, but things like ovens are usually like that. You don't necessarily know what setting they're on, and there are ways to tell. So for example, the temperature knob on at least the ovens that I've used, when it's off, it kind of clicks into position. So okay, well, this is the start. And I know that halfway around is roughly 200 degrees. So, when I'm turning on the oven, I'll just put it to that, because I know that or if I need to put it to 180, I'll put it a little bit less than that. But again, it's not exact. And there are ways around this, and there are some products out there that are specifically for blind people. Like there are microwaves that talk when you press the buttons, and things like that. But obviously not everybody has access to those, and I actually don't have any of those. Same with microwaves. Some microwaves, if you take out the food before the time is up, it will leave the remaining time on there no matter how long you leave the microwave for. So then if I go back to the microwave but there's still 15 seconds on it and I press the button for 30 seconds, well then I'll actually do 45. So I need to make sure that before I use the microwave I have to press the cancel button. And there's plenty of things like that I've kind of learned to do in my everyday life anyway, because some of these products aren't necessarily super usable. Those are just a few kind of examples of things around your home that you probably all have, or at least, mostly. But, it doesn't just stop at your home. So the next example we'll talk about is a few things that are actually a little bit more accessible. Something that you have probably realized, but maybe not. So when you're outside and you're walking around and you go to cross the street, well, the traffic light that you're at will be beeping, and it will beep at, let's just say once every half second or once every second. I don't know the exact amount of time. But then when the light turns green for you to go, it will beep a lot faster. And the reason for that is because people like me who are blind need to know when to cross the road. So I can't see if the, light has turned green. And unlike when I'm at home, I mean, there isn't really a way for me to tell if the light is green, and it probably isn't a good idea if I have to just kind of guess, like, oh, well, I can't hear any cars going, so I'm going to start walking, but it turns out I'm actually not supposed to be going. So there are plenty of examples like that. Even when you're standing at those traffic lights, if you look down at the ground, you'll notice little bumps on the ground. And those are what are called tactile pavement. So it's called that because it's tactile and you can feel it under your feet. So when I'm walking along and I can feel those little bumps under my feet, I know that I'm at a traffic light or I'm at some kind of crossing, or, there are different ones. There are ones that are more kind of lines, and they say that there are stairs coming up. So there's plenty of little things like that that also help you kind of know where you are. And I'll actually show you an example of that traffic light sound here now. So that right there is an example of that sound. And an example of an extra accessibility feature built into those lights is on a lot of traffic lights right above the button that you press, or some of them have more so touch buttons now, you can sort of put your hand on the traffic light or the little indicator, and you'll actually be able to feel the vibration. So even if you can't hear necessarily, you could also still tell if the light was green, even if you were blind and you were deaf. So you would still be able to figure out when you were able to cross the road or not. So I'll just talk you through a few of the common problems that you might run into with products if you have a disability. And it's not necessarily products, but just things in general. So, for example, if you're visually impaired, labels on like medicine bottles and food packaging. So if you heard my episode with the 8th one, a few episodes ago, I think it was episode 10 and 11, then you would have heard us talk about braille labels on some medicine boxes and bottles, and it is fantastic. I love it. So it is great to be able to pick up a bottle or a box from the press and say, oh, well, actually, this is a box of Lemsips. It's really good to be able to do that by myself, even be able to tell. A lot of them will tell you the dosage, so it'll say like 500 milligrams. It'll tell you like a little bit of information on there as well. So things like that are fantastic, but a lot of things still don't have them. And obviously it might vary by country and things like that, but here in Ireland anyway, it's pretty common if you buy something from a chemist that is actual medication, that it might have braille on it now, which is really cool. But food packaging is something that lacks that entirely. And I'm not expecting braille on my can of Pringles necessarily, but it would be nice to have some way to tell what some things are. Currently, when I want to know what something is, I have to get my phone, I open up Google Lens or Google Lookout, I think is the specific one for visually impaired people actually. It's very cool. If you actually just point your phone at things, it will tell you, it can give you descriptions of what they are, it can read you text in real time too, you don't have to take pictures, which was the problem with Google Lens. Obviously I'm not super good at taking pictures of text when I can't see the text and I don't necessarily know where it is, and that's what Google Lens needed me to do, but yeah. So that's kind of my current approach, is I'll have to take out my phone, hold it over the product, hope that the text is in the frame, and then hope that Google will be able to read that text and read it to me in a nice way, which that has its own problems. But that right there is one of the biggest things, because every day you're going to be, dealing with food, and you might be dealing with medicine, and those are two huge things where there's not a whole lot you can really do. And yeah, some things, as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned Pringles as an example. They do have like a very specific packaging. It's like a tube. And there are other things that obviously come in tubes, but I feel like it's a little bit more distinct. But when things are in your freezer and they're all in square boxes, I I don't know how you're going to tell what's what. So it's a bit of a problem. For people who aren't necessarily blind but might have other vision difficulties, contrast can be really important. So having sufficient background contrast. So if you have buttons, but the buttons in the background are a very similar color, it might be kind of hard to see the buttons, or it might be hard to read the text that's on the buttons. So even things like that can really be a big problem. And on speaking of buttons, if you ever get in a lift, or an elevator, as Americans call it, it's quite likely now that you will be able to find Braille in that lift. So there will be buttons for each floor, and either on the buttons or beside the buttons, there'll be numbers. So it'll have like 1 for the first floor, 2 for the second floor, 3 for the ground floor. And when you're actually outside of the lift, it's quite likely that it will also have Braille out there to tell you what floor you're currently on. And there are a few more things like that, like bank machines, ATMs will have, some of them have Braille, some of them have actual tactile buttons, so it won't necessarily have Braille, but you'll be able to feel, oh, this is the key for number 5, and they'll have a little raised bump on the 5 as well, actually, even if the numbers aren't necessarily raised up, so you can still tell which one is number 5. And more recently, they've actually started including headphones with bank machines, so it will kind of speak to you and tell you, oh, you're on this menu, these are your options, press 1 for this, press 2 for this, etc. So there's a lot of things like that. And just like on bank machines, actual keyboards have little raised dots on the F and J keys, and that's kind of to tell you where to put your hands. So you would put your left index finger on the F key and your right index finger on the J key. And that's how I type, because I can't see what key is what, so I just have to memorize it. So when I put my hands on the keyboard, I have my fingers on A, S, T, F, J, K, L, semicolon. So it's kind of in that middle row. And then from there, I know where all the other keys are. I know that, for example, U is above J, and E is above D. Roughly, anyway. Obviously, they're a little bit off to the side. But yeah, that's how I know how to type. And those are sort of little accessibility features that are built into all these things that you might not necessarily notice. And that's just for people who have, vision difficulties. And there's a lot more than that, and a lot more problems than that as well, but I'm not going to cover them all here today. Let's talk about a few other disabilities that might be impacted by inaccessibility in the real world. So, another one is if you have hearing difficulties. So, just like we talked about earlier, microwaves, they beep when they're finished. But obviously, if you can't hear, then you won't necessarily hear it beeping, so you won't realize that it's done. Or even if you're in a building and there's an alarm going off, you might not know unless there's also some kind of lights going off as well. Those are, again, really common things. A lot of things signify that they're done or finished or that there's a problem with noise. And obviously, if you can't hear, then how exactly are you supposed to sort of be able to observe those things? Obviously, closed captions and things like subtitles. So, subtitles are different to closed captions, but yeah. And if you don't know the difference, subtitles are essentially just what people say, but closed captions also include what people are doing or any extra like auditory information. So like if somebody slams a car door, it'll say, like car door slamming or something like that. And again, that can be really important because depending on what sounds are currently in that scene, it can make a really big difference. And you can kind of get a clue as to what's going to happen or what's going on by listening. So if you don't have both halves of that equation, then you might miss out on something. Same way that for me, if something doesn't have audio description and when I'm watching it, I might miss out on something because I'll be able to hear what's going on, but maybe on screen there's something else going on that conveys a bit of a different message, or that I would be missing out on the information of, because maybe they're pointing at something and saying, oh, look at that, and I'm like, okay, well, what is that? What are they talking about here? But if it has audio description, then it will say, oh, they point at this. And closed captions is essentially that, but for audio, which is really cool and really, really important. So if you've ever been in a shop, for example, or even on a train or things like that, then you will have probably heard some kind of announcement. And that in itself, big problem. So imagine you're on a train. All of a sudden, the train stops, everybody gets off, and you don't know why. Well, you weren't able to hear, but the driver made an announcement that the train has to stop because there's something wrong and everybody needs to get off. Or you're in a shop and they're trying to call you over the intercom because you parked your car in the wrong place, and they need you to come sort that out so that they don't have to, clamp your car or tow it or whatever it is, but you won't know. So, what exactly are you meant to do in that kind of scenario? It's really important for people to think about these things, but a lot of people don't, is the thing. A couple of other quick things here. So, for people who might have um, motor impairments, so that might be difficulty moving in certain ways or gripping objects. Obviously, there's a lot of problems that you might encounter there, even when it comes to opening doors or opening certain things, depending on what kind of handles they have. If you're in a wheelchair and you need to reach up high because there's a switch on the wall to unlock the door, many things like that. Even traffic lights, actually. The little boxes that are on traffic lights with the buttons used to be higher up than they are now. And a lot of them you'll see are a little bit lower down than they used to be so that people in wheelchairs can reach them. And it's not just people with physical or visual or, sensory disabilities that would be affected by these things. It's people who are neurodivergent or really anybody who doesn't necessarily fit the standard idea of what a person is. They might need these accommodations that people don't really think about, and they're not necessarily given to them as well, is part of the problem. And now sometimes they are, and for some people it's better than others, and it's different in other countries, so that will vary wildly, but it's still a big issue. No matter where you live in the world, you're going to encounter problems. Whether you're deaf, blind, in a wheelchair, you're neurodivergent, you're like anything, really. It doesn't matter. You're going to run into a problem, and that is kind of the sad reality. Is that I talk about here a lot of the problems with the digital world and accessibility. But the thing is that we haven't even figured out accessibility in the real world yet. And you would think that we would, at least with the digital world, that is relatively new. But this, physical world is not, and these disabilities or, whatever you want to call them, aren't necessarily new. And some of them obviously are more so when you get into things like being neurodivergent. They're not new, but our understanding of them is. But a lot of them aren't new necessarily. So you would think we would have that figured out by now. But we don't, because people don't think about them. When somebody thought about putting that intercom system in the shop, they didn't think about, oh, well, what if somebody in here is deaf? They just said, well, we need to make announcements, we need speakers, so I'm going to do that now. And that was the end of that conversation. And that's kind of part of the problem. I've already mentioned a couple of the things that help make things more accessible. Whether it's, clear labels that are in large fonts with good color contrast between the text and the background, including Braille whenever possible, or at least making the letters that are there tactile. Being able to use voice controls for things, so that if you can't necessarily touch something or move something, you can still control it in a way. And even for me, as somebody who can't see, voice controls are really handy because, as I think I've mentioned, I hate typing on my phone. So I'll just, when I'm doing a Google search, I'll usually do a voice search instead of typing it in because it's a lot slower and I'm way more likely to make mistakes than I am on an actual keyboard. So even having things like that, are really, really, really helpful. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of companies who are, I don't want to say doing things right, because they do have their own problems, but who are really trying and who are actually making a difference. For example, now with smartphones, if you have a smartphone, you're guaranteed to have a lot of accessibility features built in, whether you're on iOS or Android. For example, on Android, we have TalkBack, which is a screen reader. And on iOS, there's VoiceOver, which is a screen reader. And those are built in. So no matter what Android phone you will have access to TalkBack. So it doesn't matter who you buy it from or how much it costs, you're going to be able to use it if you can't see. And that right there is a huge step forward. And there are examples like that for loads of other accessibility features, whether it be high color contrast or being able to set custom gestures or control your phone in a certain way or with an external device or with voice commands and do all these other things. I believe some phones can even, or some TVs can even do like there's audio description that you can turn on your TV now, so that when you're actually watching like TV channels, not necessarily streaming services, that's different how that works. It will have audio description, and that's just a setting that you can have on your TV now. There are so many examples like that in technology. With actual physical products, it's, I don't want to say a little bit less so like that, but kind of. So the problem is, right, is recently things have kind of moved to being touchscreen, right? And that presents a big problem for somebody like me who can't see. So there was a different version of the coffee machine that we got, and it was touchscreen. But I specifically wanted the non-touchscreen one because it had buttons, and I could tell what they were going to do. And I didn't actually check, to be fair, but I felt like I knew that the touchscreen one wouldn't have a screen reader on it, and it probably doesn't. I can almost guarantee that it doesn't, because almost nothing like that does, because they're not necessarily built on Android, and if they are, it's not the full version of Android, so it doesn't include TalkBack. So even companies like that who have different versions of their products that have physical buttons on them to make things easier, if they don't necessarily have a screen reader, having that choice is a really big deal. It's really, really important. Even on public transport, you'll see now a lot of buses and trains will have wheelchair ramps that can extend out from their doors, or they'll have text and audio announcements, or they'll have a special kind of place for wheelchairs to go or for people with disabilities to sit, which I know is really helpful for me, especially when I'm by myself. The last thing I want to be doing is kind of falling over people trying to feel the seats and see if there's somebody sitting there. So having a designated place where I can go sit and I know should be free is great. It avoids that big problem, and it's usually near enough the doors, so it makes things a lot easier for me. Now, sometimes people sit there when they're not supposed to, but that's a whole other issue, and that's nothing to do with the people who put that feature in. That's to do with the people who are misusing it, if you will. But it's progress, and that's what really matters. So, although in this episode I did kind of mention that accessibility still isn't perfect, even in the real world, it definitely is getting better, and I've noticed it getting better, even throughout my life. So that is a big deal. And kind of the point of this is to show that things aren't perfect in the digital world or in the physical world, but in both they're improving. And the thing is, we get to say how much they improve. So if the next time you're in a position where you can say, oh, actually, maybe we should consider this, whether you're in sales or marketing or whatever, even if you're in education, and you're planning out a curriculum and you're making a PowerPoint presentation and you're adding images to it. And it's just, hey, let's add some alt text to this. Or, if you're designing a new building, if you're an engineer, and you say, oh, well, actually, let's make sure that there's wheelchair access to this building. And look, some of these things are legal requirements now, but I said that will vary depending on where you live and all sorts of other things. But it's in reality up to all of us to make things better and to make things more accessible. So that's kind of the takeaway from this, is be mindful. And you don't need to remember everything that I've said here, but just think about it. The next time, as I said, that you get a chance to have an influence over something, think about, how can I make this better for somebody else? And that's really all that I want you to be able to do. And if you see a company doing something good, make sure that you let them know. Whether it's liking their post or buying their product or whatever it might be. Make sure that you support that, because that's good. It's good for me and it's good for you. You know, it's literally better for everybody in every way. And if you have a disability, or even if you don't, and you notice something that might be a problem for somebody who does have one, let somebody know. Whether it's the people who own that product or who make it, or whether it's you're on a bus and you say, oh, well, actually, this bus doesn't have a dedicated wheelchair ramp. Let somebody know about it. That is going to be it for this week's episode of the Envisiontech podcast. Make sure that you come back next week, where I'm hoping to have a guest on the podcast. And again, thank you all for listening. I've been your host, Paul Geoghegan, and I will see you all next week.